Welcome to Textile Update, the podcast where we can share our passion for textiles, fibers, and yarns. This is Gwendolyn Hustvedt.
This is the second of two episodes where I talk about basic weaves. So weaves made with the basic loom. And in this episode, I look at basket weaves, twill weaves, and satin weaves. I left off my discussion of basic weaves in the last episode by talking about unbalanced plain weaves. And I mentioned that there was one other plain weave variety that can be considered part of that plain weave category. So it has a one-to-one interlacing pattern that's called the basket weave. But because it's separate conceptually, I wanted to go ahead and talk about it at the beginning of this episode where I'm talking about the two other categories of basic weaves, twill and satin. So the basket weave has a one-to-one interlacing pattern, but the yarn, the filling yarn, travels over more than one warp yarn. So how is that? Well, it's because we have yarns, two or more warp yarns that are being treated as one warp yarn. So they may be, they're always interlaced together. In fact, they may have been threaded through the same heddle. And this could be done in order to make the setup of the loom quicker. So these fabrics can be manufactured very quickly. The purpose is just to get the yarn out there, and they are very often used for things like sailcloth, canvas, or monk's cloth even as a category, because the monks wouldn't want to waste time weaving when they could be praying. And so we'll see that this filling yarn still has a one-to-one interlacing pattern, but when we look closely, there's two warp yarns underneath every interlacing, not one, or maybe three warp yarns under every interlacing. Now, this gets a little more complicated because we could choose to either have one filling yarn being interlaced with these two or more warp yarns that are acting as a group, right, threaded potentially even through the same heddle in the harness, or else in right next to each other in one harness that they're always being raised together. Right, so we would put yarn 1 and 2 through heddles in harness 1, and then yarn 3 and 4 through heddles in harness 2, and then yarn 5 and 6 through heddles in harness 1, and yarn 7 and 8 through heddles in harness 2. So when we lifted harness 1, we'd be lifting yarns 1, 2, 5, and 6, and when we lifted harness 2, we'd be lifting yarns 3, 4, 7, and 8. Always, right? So those two yarns are always being treated as a group. And so if we only had one filling yarn that was being interlaced with those two or more yarns being treated as a group, we would call that a half basket. But if we had two yarns that were interlacing with two filling yarns, so we literally had two yarns together on our shuttle and we're pulling them across together, wow, we're just really weaving quickly here, then we would have what's called a full basket. And a full basket is when the proportion of warp and fill yarns that are being treated as one are equal. So if we had 4 warp yarns being treated as one and we had 2 filling yarns being treated as one, that would still be a half basket. I don't know what we do about 1 to 3 or 2 to 3, right, or some other odd number. Those don't happen very often. Very typically, we just have a half basket, which is 1 filling yarn for every 2 warp yarns, or a full basket, which is 2 or more to every 2 or more. So 2 by 2 or 3 by 3 or 4 by 4 would all be categories of full baskets. And in fact, monk's cloth is what we call it when we have 3 by 3 or 4 by 4, typically made from wool. And whereas Oxford cloth is a 2 by 1, so 2 warp yarns to every 1 filling yarn. Made Oxford cloth would be a medium weight. Canvas and duck or sailcloth would be heavier and heavier. And you can understand if you had to power all of your ships to run your entire global trade empire, you would want to be able to weave this fabric as quickly as possible. So definitely look up some interlacing patterns for basket weaves so that you can tell the difference between a half basket and a full basket, because if you have a half basket, you might be looking at canvas or Oxford or sailcloth. If you have a full basket, you're probably looking at monk's cloth. That's the basket weave. So if somebody asks you, you can actually say, yeah, I just learned about basket weaving. Terrible joke. All right, let's talk about twill weaves. Twill weaves are a totally separate category of basic weaves. They're not considered plain weaves. And that's because they have a distinguishing feature on the surface of the fabric. The very short floats, when the warp yarn travels over 2 or 3 yarns before interlacing again, means that we get this distinctive diagonal pattern on the surface of the fabric, and we call that diagonal pattern a wale, spelled W-A-L-E. I think this word wale might be, I'm not an etymologist, I'm not an entomologist either. I'm not an etymologist, although I like etymology. I think the word wale in this case may be similar to a word that we would think of as wheel, W-E-A-L. And if anybody ever said, oh, my daddy just wailed on me with the paddle, right? Then wheel is the stripe of raised skin that's created by being hit by like a stick, right? A wheel. And so I'm pretty sure that that's where we get this wale from. It's like a stripe of raised area. So if we see wales on the surface, the wales are like the ribs in the unbalanced plain weave, but those went from side to side in the crosswise direction. These wales go in the diagonal direction. So they're not ribs, they're wales. We'll use a loom that has at least 3 or more harnesses. 4 is pretty typical because we will have the yarns being raised typically in sets of 2, but in a progressive pattern. So if we had yarn 1 in harness 1, yarn 2 in harness 2, yarn 3 in harness 3, and yarn 4 in harness 4, we would start by lifting harness 1 and 2, right? And so 3 and 4 would be the unders, and 1 and 2 would be the overs. But the next time we would lift harness 2 and 3. So now 1, which was an over just a moment ago, is now an under. And 3, which was an under a moment ago, is now an over. So this is how it shifts. The little 2 yarn float shifts to one side. And then we would lift yarn 3 and 4. And then we would lift yarn 1 and 4. And then we'd start over. So 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 1, 4, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 1, 4. And so if you're weaving a twill, you get this pattern. Typically you're stepping on the pedals that raise the harnesses with your foot, right? Kind of like playing an organ. And really about the only thing we can talk about in a twill is what direction that wale goes in, right? Did we do 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 1, 4, or did we do 3, 4, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 4, right? That's which way did we go? Obviously, it can go in the right-handed direction or the left-handed direction. Lucky, we don't use S and Z here. We just talk right and left. So if it goes up and to the right, it's a right-handed twill. And if it goes up and to the left, it's a left-handed twill. So you could probably look smart when you mention that. But in terms of identifying, what's the difference between gabardine and cavalry twill, there really isn't a quick and simple way to do that. So I'm not going to dig into that too much. I can tell you about 2 kinds of twill patterns that you can identify with your eyes. The first one is houndstooth, which is basically a plaid, only done with a twill weave. So if it was plain weave, it would be a plaid, but if it's twill woven, then it creates this houndstooth effect, and that's because the square in a plaid ends up kind of having jaggedy edges where we do that slight diagonal pattern, right? So I don't know, somebody named it after their dog's teeth, I guess. The other one is called a reverse or broken twill, and this is where we set the loom up so that first we put the yarn in 1, 2, 3, and 4, but what happens if the next ones we do, we put the 5th yarn into harness 4, the 6th yarn into harness 3, the 7th yarn into harness 2, and the 8th yarn into harness 1. So we now reverse the direction that we were going, right? So we had our diagonals started in one direction, and then now suddenly they're going in the other direction when we lift the harness. Well, we wouldn't do it with just 8 yarns. We would do it over, an inch or 2 inches of fabric, and we create a design that's called herringbone. and very often done in two different colors, right? Well, the filling yarn is one color and the warp yarn is the other color. And so black and white, for example, if we had white filling and black warp, we would end up with black stripes that kind of came down at an angle on the fabric. So if you're thinking about twill fabrics, you just want to look for that wale and identify that the warp yarns are going over more than one filling yarn at a time, or the filling yarns are going over more than one warp yarn at a time, but it's in this diagonal pattern. So not like a basket weave where they always act together, but in a diagonal pattern. Like basket weaves or satin weaves that we'll talk about in a minute, these floats where the yarns aren't interlaced with every other yarn, it means that there are fewer interlacings, which means that the fabric is a little bit less strong. We'll be able to get a higher thread count because interlacings take up space. So if we're skipping an interlacing every third yarn, then we can get a third more yarns in. And so we'll have increased yarn twist, which makes up for the strength we might have lost with interlacing up to a certain point. They are more easily unraveled, but the plus side is they don't wrinkle quite as much. And that's because the yarns can slip around a tiny bit, right? So they can evade a wrinkle that they see coming. So that's really all there is to say about the twill weaves. It could be a whole world in and of itself, but because there isn't a quick way to really describe the difference between the different types that you could use in a purchasing setting, I don't want to get too deeply into it. Let's talk about the satin weaves. Now the satin weaves have a much longer float. So they will go over 4 or more yarns. So there is no distinguishing feature on the surface like a wale. The distinguishing feature is that one side has very long floats and the other side kind of has this random pebbly look. So they're not reversible. Twill weaves weren't reversible either. We always have a right side if you think about it. Your jeans are twill woven. Denim is by definition a twill weave. And if you look at the back side of denim, you can see more of the filling yarn, and the front side you can see more of the warp yarns. The warp yarns were dyed with indigo. The filling yarns are left white. And so, you can see that that's not reversible. Satin weave is the same way. There's a definite right side and a wrong side to satin fabric. They have a roughly 3-to-1 balance, so we can get 3 times as many warp yarns as filling yarns. So if we have a 400 count fabric, then we could say, there's 300 warp yarns and 100 filling yarns. And the interlacings are 4 times less than a 1-to-1 fabric, right? Potentially, it depends on the number of the length of the floats because it's 4 or more. With the satin fabric, there's a couple of main things that we could use to talk about them. The first is which direction the long floats go in, because in fact we could have the long floats as warp yarns floating over filling yarns, or we could have filling yarns floating over warp yarns, right? And so we either have warp faced, where the warp yarns are the ones that mostly show, or we could have fill faced, where the filling yarns are the ones that mostly show. And I only bring that up because in a minute I'm going to explain that one type of fabric is more commonly warp-faced or always warp-faced. Another type of fabric will be either or. So, satin fabrics are always warp-faced and they're made with filament yarns and they have very long floats. So if you are buying a set of satin sheets, then the satin sheets will be made with filament yarns. So they're either silk or they're synthetic. In either case, they were either really expensive or they're not going to be very absorbent, which makes them not very comfortable for sleeping on all night. They certainly are very lustrous and they have a very smooth surface. However, they snag very easily, which means they will not be very durable. This is where the lie about thread count really comes to play. To get that really high thread count, we had to reduce the number of interlacings, which makes the fabric less strong. And now we also have fabric that's more vulnerable to snagging. So it was really not a good trade-off to have that many yarns in order just to brag about a number. Satin fabrics basically have the fewest interlacings. So satin warp-faced, made with filament yarns, and very long floats. We're really going for the shine of the filament yarns. Back in the day, very often made from silk, nowadays from any filament, synthetic fiber, or silk. Now, sateen, on the other hand, so S-A-T-E-E-N, so satin only with the "een," is basically satin's poor country cousin. Sateen is made with spun yarns, very often cotton. It can be either warp or fill-faced, and that's because with the satin, we would have the long filament yarns that are very strong and can withstand the tension of weaving. Go ahead and have those in the warp direction, right? And then we can really pack them in because they're so nice and small. Whereas with sateen, we really don't have the size advantage of the filament yarn, so we'll just basically do whatever works best for for the particular yarns we have. Shorter floats so the fabric isn't quite as shiny, but if you buy sateen sheets, they'll be made from cotton, so comfortable enough to sleep on. They'll have a nice high thread count, but they will not be any higher quality or more durable than a plain weave fabric with a lower thread count, because that plain weave fabric with a lower thread count had more interlacings. So sateen, spun yarns, satin, filament yarns. You can see why I shoved basket weaves into this particular episode, because, right, I don't have anything more to say about plain weaves at this point, and so we didn't have a balanced podcast ratio here. We didn't quite have a 2-to-1, but well, now I'm just talking, so I'll let it go.